what are we doing? We're talking about developing the top line. We get questions sometimes about, so how do you build the top line? How do you build the back muscles and so on? And the question is sometimes not that easy to answer in a satisfactory way, because you can just say, well, just ride your horse in balance and make him straight, and then the top line develops. You know, that's it. And that, of course, it doesn't help a whole lot, right? So the thing is, when you balance your horse and you straighten your horse, the horse will lift the withers and he'll expand the rib cage, right? And then you see how the muscles in front of the withers expand until the base of the neck is the widest part of the neck, right? And when you're done riding, you can see how the muscles along the lumbar spine of the horse seem inflated. It's almost like somebody pumped some air into them, right? So there's more blood flow to them, so they look a little bigger than they were before you started the session. And same thing with the croup. Like if you look on top of the croup, you know, that looks a little bit more filled out if the session was productive. And it's a good thing to check, you know, before and after. It's like, what does the musculature look like when you start? What does it look like when you're done with a session? Like look at the base of the neck, look at the back muscles when you take the saddle off after riding, look at the croup, and you know, if it looks a little bit more filled out, it's a good sign. And like when it's spring or fall and it's not terribly warm outside, and you put a cooler on the horse after the workout, then you may see that there's a little condensation forming on the cooler. Even if the horse was dry during the ride, right, and didn't sweat, but you put the cooler on, you may find that in certain areas on the cooler, there's a little, it's moisture forming. And those are the muscles that worked more. And so it's good if then the cooler has some moisture over the croup muscles, the lumbar spine, the side of the hind legs, you know, from lateral movement, from side stepping, you typically then, you know, warm up the side of the hind legs. And if the base of the neck, sides, you know, the withers, around the withers, the area, if that gets sweaty, shoulders a little bit, it's a good sign, right? And it's a way of checking how effective you were. And to get the horse into that uphill balance, you know, you typically have to get the hind legs moving underneath you, which is, you know, effectively done by incorporating some form of sidestepping, even if it's very simple, even if you're just enlarging the circle a little bit here and there, or asking the croup to yield onto a slightly bigger circle, right? Or if you're asking the haunches to yield a little into the circle, that already, you know, puts weight on one hind leg and engages the other hind leg. That way, you know, you can shorten the wheelbase, so to speak, bring both hind legs under the body. Sidestepping also prevents one hind leg from drifting off to the side, right? It's a good way to counteract the horse's crookedness. And then once you feel like the hind legs are underneath you, you can feel them underneath you, then you can try to shift weight into them by half vaulting, by doing down transitions into a hind leg, by doing corners, voltas, turns on the haunches, for example. So all these little exercises can be used to shift weight into the hind legs. Also, rein back. You can use the rein back, of course, to put weight into a hind leg, right? And then you could expand on this and do something that Melissa Sims at Mindorf's used to do a lot. She would ride one exercise, whatever, one reprise of something with the horse put together with a certain degree of collection, and then she would let the horse stretch forward, downward, right? Not very long, just maybe a circle or two or half a circle even, and then pick the reins up, right? Put the horse back together, let the horse stretch a little bit, put him back together, let him stretch a little bit. That is often a good way to develop elasticity and develop the core muscles and the top line, the back muscles of the horse. I had a teacher who was also an old Mindorf student who had us do exercises around that train of thought, where he would, for example, have us put the horse together on a 20-meter circle, maybe, and then he asked us to let the horse start to chew the reins out of our hands, and while the horse is chewing the reins out of our hands, ask for a down transition from trot to walk, for example, right? Because he wanted to test also, if we were able to ride a down transition without pulling on the reins, right? So that was sort of his train of thought to check on us. Then you can do the opposite. You can ride the horse at the walk on a circle, for example, and, on the bit, put together. And then you could ask for a transition from walk to trot while you're letting the horse chew the reins out of your hands. Basically, then you're testing whether the horse stays in balance as you do the up transition, or does he just run away from you, right? So it's a test of how well you have the horse on the seat. It's a test of the horse's self-carriage. These things are not that easy to ride in a way, but they could be a really interesting thing to experiment with, and they will give you interesting feedback, interesting data, right? Even if you can't do it, that's an important piece of information too, right? That's that he's not on the seat enough, he's not in self-carriage enough, so he loses balance when I do that, right? So then you can work on those missing links, so to speak. Another really interesting or helpful exercise is, for example, you could ride, let's say, ride a circle or volte at A, volte in the first corner of the long side, or otherwise 20-meter circle at A, then ride shoulder in for half a long side in the trot. That's a good trot exercise. Then when you go to E or B, ride a 20-meter circle on a single track and let the horse chew the reins out of your hands for half a circle. Then pick the reins up again, so you're spending like one circle basically around X. And then when you have the reins picked up, you're back in the middle of the long side where you had interrupted your shoulder in. Continue the shoulder in, right, to the end of the long side, and maybe there go on another circle. Let's see, ride a single track circle, let the horse chew the reins out of your hands, pick the reins up again, maybe ride another long side with shoulder in. So these are really interesting little games you can play with a horse that improve the suppleness and the adjustability. So it's like a how do you call it, an accordion. So I wanted to say harmonica, but it's accordion in English. So close the frame and then stretch the frame. So you alternate between the two. That and always trying to keep the horse nicely balanced, of course, as you're changing the length of the frame. That's also a good method to improve or build the top line muscles. Another interesting thing is to walk 20-meter circle in a shoulder 4 position and then pick up the reins from there in the shoulder 4 position on that circle. That could be a really interesting little exercise. And then just, develop your own exercises based on these ideas, right? You can just take the train of thought behind these exercises and make your own and apply them to different lines and different combinations and so on. So these are all very interesting little games you can play with a horse, essentially, right? And it's a good way to develop a certain adjustability in your horse. Then, of course, you can also build, your top line muscles by riding up and down hills. If you live in a hilly area, going uphill, the hind legs have to push more. Going downhill, they have to carry more. You can build top line with trotting or lunging over poles, cavalettis, little free jumping, with low but wide obstacles, right? So the horse has to stretch a little bit over those little obstacles. These are all options you have, right, in which, with which you can develop the horse's top line muscles, right? But it's essentially, having an uphill balance, uphill in the sense that the hind legs support the weight and the horse lifts the withers, regardless of whether the frame is longer or shorter or whatever. But it's important that the withers lift up, right? And when the withers are lifted, the muscles at the base of the neck expand, and then you can see that that's the widest point of the neck, and then the neck gets thinner towards the poll. So, let's see, Gloria Cepeda says, did you just say walk in a circle? I lost the signal, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was a little exercise, walk on a long rein, 20-meter circle, put the horse in a shoulder 4 position on the long rein, and then gather up the reins. And it's, you can do that very nicely by asking the inside hind to step a little more under the body and then sit on the hind legs, pick up the slack. And nudge the inside hind leg more under the body, sit on the hind legs, pick up the slack, and then you can go from a long rein to an uphill posture with a short rein, and then you could let the horse stretch again and, do the same thing in the other direction. So these are really interesting little games. They make the warm-up interesting and fun, and interesting for the horse, and expand the vocabulary and the horizon a little bit, of the horse. Yeah, so Carolyn Palmer says, love the idea of the shoulder 4, then onto a circle, stretching them down, then back to more collection shoulder 4. That really makes sense. It works well, and the horses like it. A lot of horses stretch very well out of this shoulder 4, shoulder in position. Like as you go from shoulder in onto a circle, you offer the forward downward. A lot of horses think, oh great, this is easier, this feels good, after they had to sit more in the shoulder in and flex the hind legs more, then it's like, oh good, now it's a little bit of a break, and then put them back together. So yeah. So Gabriele Pop, how do you pick up the withers? Yeah, the withers you lift. You can do it with lifting your pubic bone, your solar plexus, belly button a little bit. Like everything in the front of your body could come up a little bit. Like I sometimes like to picture like a conveyor belt around my torso that goes up in front and down in the back. So you feel like you're letting your shoulder blades drop and your tailbone drop a little bit, and you lift the pubic bone, lift the belly button, solar plexus, or belt buckle or whatever, and that gives the horse already a little bit more of an uphill orientation, which lifts the withers. That lifting of the withers comes out from the hind legs, right? So it only works when the hind legs are close enough to the center of gravity and flexing enough, and then they can, it's like weightlifting, they can lift the shoulder, withers, forehand up, And then when that happens, you feel there's a stretch in the top line. Like Waldemar Zeunig describes it pretty well. He says that in that uphill balance, the back muscles of the horse stretch behind the rider, back and down, in a back and downward direction, right? And the pelvis tucks a little bit. And in front of the rider, the top line stretches forward, upward a little bit, right, with that lifting of the withers. You can support the lifting of the withers also by, for example, applying a little stirrup pressure when the hind leg on that side is on the ground. Like if you, for example, when the outside hind is down, you could put a little pressure into the outside stirrup and then give like a little half fold with one of the reins. Could be outside rein, could be inside rein. You could even do it with both reins with this just very slight upward feel. It's not visible. It's not a big movement. It's just a very light lifting. And sometimes it feels like with my stirrup, I can press the hind leg into the ground, and with the rein, I can lift the forehand an inch, a centimeter or two out of the ground a little bit, and then it changes balance, right? In the canter, it's almost easier because you have a bigger up and down movement of the forehand. So when the withers come up, the outside hind is on the ground. You can use that technique of stepping into the outside stirrup and then half vaulting with one of the reins and trying to get the forehand to come up off the ground a little more. And you, in the canter, you can also support that by letting your own pelvis come up a little more, lifting belly button, pubic bone, etc., a little more, and that gives the horse a more uphill orientation. But yeah, often, the way to lift something is by pressing into the ground with another body part. Right? So the horse can lift his forehand by pressing with his hind legs against the ground and then lifting up like that. It's a little bit like picturing a weightlifter with these big weights, right? With a big barbell, they kind of go under the barbell squat, and then they lift the barbell by extending their leg joints, right? So they press essentially with their feet down against the ground, and then as they press against the ground, they can lift the weight. And with the horse, it's a little similar, right? They have to step under the body with the hind legs, then they press their hind legs into the ground and lift the front end up, right? And we can encourage or enhance the stepping down of the hind leg, the pressing against the ground with a stirrup pressure, right? We can press the hind leg a little into the ground, and that allows the horse to lighten the forehand and lift up. So that's another way of looking at it or thinking about it. Right? So yeah, let's see if there were any questions. Oh yeah, on Zoom here, exactly. So I often only see part of the name. I think it's Georgina. Says, is it better to walk or trot uphill? You could do either. You could do either one. Depends a little bit on how steep the hill is, right? If the hill is fairly steep, the horses often want to trot or canter because they feel like that's a little easier. If you make them walk slowly, then of course that's very intense, right? Then that can be almost harder than trotting. So I mean, you can do either way. Sometimes you may feel like one option is more effective than the other one, right? But yeah, if the hill is fairly steep and you insist on the horse walking, then it becomes a very intense workout, right? Jackie says, am I right in thinking that hill work only works for the top line if it's done in walk? Not really. I mean, if the downhill slope is, steep enough, then you should only walk, of course, right? And, otherwise it's maybe not so healthy for the horse's legs. But it depends more on the balance of the horse. I mean, you can develop the top line also in the trotting up and down hills, uphills. I mean, if the downhill slope is very shallow, you can trot down the hill too. But otherwise, uphill, you just have to make sure the horse is round, is on the bit, is going through the back, and then that would develop the top line too. Right? And then so Jackie asks, would it be correct to describe the action for asking the wither to lift as slightly lifting into a kneeling position? I feel like if I think about lifting the tummy, I will just hollow my back. Yeah, you shouldn't hollow the back exactly. It's depending a little bit on your conformation, it could be that you feel like you're kneeling more. That's often the feeling I'm getting too, that I stretch my knees forward down and then my pelvis swings up. And since although if you tend to have a hollow back, if you think of lifting your pubic bone, that should actually straighten the pelvis up. That should get you out of that. It's interesting that when you think of lifting the tummy, you hollow your back. That's interesting. Maybe think of lifting a different part of your anatomy. Like when you feel like lifting your solar plexus hollows your back, maybe then think of lifting the pubic bone more. That's a lower point of the body, so that should bring the pelvis into an upright position. Or maybe think of lowering the tailbone. Maybe that'll do it. Like maybe just think of moving a different part of your body. and see how that affects the curvature of your lumbar spine. Also, she says lifting the pubic bone but not tilting the pelvis. Well, ideally the pelvis should be somewhere close to vertical, to a neutral position, right? That the pelvis should be in a place where you feel like there is room to tip forward and back to absorb whatever movement the horse's back makes, right? So don't go too far away from the vertical. If you feel like your pelvis really tips forward, then you get towards the into an end position, right, towards the forward limit of the range of motion, and then you're jammed, and that's probably not healthy for the lower back, right? Or if the pelvis tips very far back, and you have this sort of a rounded slouching back, then you're at the opposite end of the range of motion. That's not so great either. So stay somewhere in the middle where you feel like there is room for my pelvis to tip forward and back, right? So try to find a sort of a healthy middle. And then you can experiment, like what happens if I lift my belly button or my solar plexus or my belt buckle? What happens if I lift the pubic bone? What happens if I forget about the front of the body? What happens if I rock the top of the pelvis back, like I want to tilt it back on top of my seat bones? Or what happens if I think of lowering the tailbones, right? So you can initiate the movement from different places, and then maybe one of them will feel like, okay, yeah, that feels balanced and it doesn't hurt my back, and I feel like now the withers come up, right? So that could be a way of approaching it. So Jackie says, yes, so lifting the pubic bone without losing the vertical position of the pelvis. Thank you, very helpful. Oh, but thank you. Yeah, sometimes you just have to get creative. And the thing is, we're all built differently. And then, of course, the teachers tend to describe what works for them in terms of seat, aids, movements, positioning. And if you're built differently than I am, then what I do may not work at all for you, right? Because of difference in pelvis and curvature of the spine, etc. So you have to find a different way of doing it, right? You may have to move the body differently or initiate the movement from a different part and so on. So then, yeah, it's good to have sort of an idea of the basic concept rather than the nitty-gritty technical details, right? And Lisa Blazevich says, do our shoulders move when we do this? Not necessarily. I mean, you could just let your shoulder blades sink back and down and then try to lift the pubic bone. Then, you can observe when I lift my pubic bone, what happens to my shoulders? Do they do something? Like, do they move more back? Do they move up? Do they move down? Like, sometimes, there's this, what in Feldenkrais they call parasitic movements. I just learned that in some of our courses. And I've observed that in my own writing too, that if I deliberately move one part of my body or contract one muscle or release one muscle, my body does other things too that I didn't really want it to do, right? It will contract or release other muscles that had no authorization to do so, right? So you could focus on doing something with your pelvis, for example, and then at the same time, keep an eye on, well, what are my shoulders doing? What is my head doing? What are my hands doing? What are my legs doing? Are they doing something they're not supposed to do, right? Or, does it all fit together? And then when you realize there is this, parasitic movement that I didn't really want and that's not really helping, then you could think of, well, how can I move, for example, my pelvis in a productive way without these other movements that seem to take place, right? And so then you can train yourself basically to just move the body part that you want to move and leave the rest alone, right? And that's sort of a huge research topic that will basically keep you busy for the rest of your life, right? So nobody ever reaches the end of that. It's always like a work in progress, and you will constantly discover new things, right? New possible movements and new ways in which your body moves, whether you like it or not, or whether you wanted that or not, and then you can decide whether you want that movement or whether you don't want that movement, and then you can change it from there. Yeah, so huge topic that will keep you really busy for the rest of your life. And it's really worth investigating that. It's really worth pursuing that, studying that, experimenting with that, and that gives you a database of experiences that you can then draw on, you know, and it will show you things that work, things that don't work, and then you can you know, build on the things that work and try to avoid the things that don't work and so on. So that's how I learned a lot of things, just by thinking, trying things out, watching what happens, tinkering with it, changing it a little bit, and so on, you know. Yeah. So, Gabriele Pop says, thank you, excellent explanation. Thank you. Mindy Jones says, I tried to trot my horse uphill the other day for the first time. He was very unbalanced. Will this get better? Interesting. So, trotting uphill the first time he was unbalanced. What happened exactly? Did he run away? Did he invert? It's likely to get better with practice. I mean, it's something the horses have to get used to also. If you live in a very flat area, or if the horse only gets ridden in an arena that's level, and then you suddenly go out and try to trot uphill, it could be that's a challenge for him, that it feels weird to the horse at first. Then what you could do is practice that. If you feel that that's really hard for the horse, maybe walk up the hill, put everything in place so that the horse feels balanced and round on the bit, everything is good. Then you ask for an up transition, right, and see what happens, right? If you feel like it's falling apart, then go back to the walk. Put them all back together, you know, prepare again, try again, and so on. And then you could also think, well, what happens exactly in that up transition? If he gets worse, if he loses balance, in what way does he lose balance? What happens exactly, and what could I do to help him out so he doesn't lose balance? Maybe I need to change the way I sit. Maybe I have to change the way I ask or support. It could be that your seat and your aid for the up transition has to be different going up an incline than when you're in the arena. It could be that you didn't adjust to that, didn't adjust your aids for this. Always a possibility, right? Yeah, fine. She's fine walking, she says. Okay, no, just found it hard. It was a bridle way with stones. Yeah, it could be that the footing is different on that bridle way, you know, from what he's used to, and that can make a difference. Like if the footing is harder or softer than what he's used to. Some horses are a little sensitive. They don't like hard footing, and then they tighten the back because it feels unpleasant, right? And then suddenly they're not so round in the trot, you know, as you're used to maybe in the arena. So these are all elements that can play a role in that, you know, but still, even if, yeah, almost like he didn't know where to put his legs. So it sounds like he's not used to going up a hill, so maybe, you know, that takes a little getting used to for him. But yeah, then you can think about, well, what could I do differently in terms of my seat? How can I adjust my seat, or how can I support maybe differently with my legs, also with the rein contact? Do I need to, I don't know, release differently, maybe release more slowly, or maybe release just the one rein first and not both at the same time, right? So there's different ways you can do it. And you may find that you can support him in a certain way that he stays balanced in that transition. And yeah, so if the footing is different, and if there is an incline, it's very likely that you have to use your seat and your aids a little differently than if you're in your normal arena, you know. So, and with a little experimentation, you can probably find exactly how you have to do it. Yeah. Yeah. Mindy Jones is so unbalanced, I almost slid off. Oh, yeah. Interesting. If it's really difficult, really bad, you could also maybe ride another horse and pony that one. So the horse can do these transitions without weight of the rider on their back at first. That can be helpful, right? If you have a good, reliable horse, right, and if the other one behaves well when you pony him, then you could try this. Do some just walk trot transitions up the hill, right? That could be an interesting thing to do. Yeah, it sounds like he just needs to figure out his coordination, his balance, right? So it's yeah, something he hasn't done before apparently, and yeah, then experiment a little with your seat and with your aids and see if you can support him a little differently to make it easier. And now, Vitor Villarreal, how many minutes walking up and down hills would you recommend? Oh, that depends. You know, depends on how steep the hills are. Depends on how well trained the horse is, or how much stamina, how much strength the horse has. Listen to the horse. You know, when you feel like he's starting to get tired, then you know, time to finish. It's hard to give a absolute numbers. You know, depends a little bit on how big and tall the horse is, how big and tall you are. So big, strong horse, small rider, you know, can do a little bit more than a small horse and a big rider, you know, that sort of thing. A very highly trained horse that has a lot of strength and stamina can do more than a green horse that's, you know, maybe 4 years old or so. So yeah, listen to the horse and, you know, start slowly with fewer minutes, fewer repetitions, and then expand gradually. Alison Hutton says we have steep hills and I feel that these put my mare onto her shoulders. Going uphill, interesting. Shouldn't really. I mean, going uphill, they have to push a little more. Well, I mean, as you're going uphill, the horses usually feel better balanced, right? But when you're done with going uphill and you're going on a, you know, horizontal plane again, and now the uphill climb made the horse push more behind, it could be that they still continue pushing more when you're on the horizontal again, and that then you feel like, now my horse is leaning on my reins, or now my horse is on the forehand. That could be sort of a side effect. Then you may have to rebalance the horse when you're done, you know. Or as you go up the hill, you could try and sit more on the hind legs, right? Rather than going in 2-point seat and lightening the seat, maybe then you feel like I need to sit on the hind legs more so they carry me better and flex more, and they don't push exclusively. So again, you can play a little with the seat as you go uphill. And then, you know, once the hill is done and you're going, you know, on a horizontal line, horizontal plane, maybe, you know, work a little bit on flexing the hind legs and carrying a little more. So yeah, everything we do can potentially have side effects, right? And that we may have to then deal with. Yeah, it depends a little bit on the exact circumstances, right? Jennifer King, why not in hand? I wonder if that's about the going uphill in trot. I was thinking of that actually. You can, of course, lead your horse in hand, you know, up and down hills. But if you want to practice the trot transitions uphill, that, you know, may be hard work for you. You may have to run pretty fast. So, you know. Yeah. So Jackie Billington says, do you like using quarters to increase hind leg engagement and assist in lifting the withers and shoulders? Yes. When the horses are at that stage in training, absolutely. You can, for example, develop a more uphill canter depart, right? Like when a horse likes to go canter fast and downhill, and you put them on a circle in haunches in, and then ask him to do a walk to canter transition, then they will, without allowing him to leave the haunches in position and without allowing him to leave that line that you're riding, then he will figure out that the old way of cantering fast downhill isn't possible with haunches in and on a circle, right? Haunches in and circle only really works when you canter uphill, right? So you can get the horse to really rethink the way he canters. So that can be super effective. That's hard work, right? So that's why I then do very short reprises, maybe 3-4 strides, and then back to the walk, get reorganized again, get the haunches in back if you lost it, get the circle line back if you lost it, ask for the up transition, and so on. And, and then when you've done this a few times and you feel like, okay, the horse lifts nicely into the canter, I get a good feeling, good balance, then you could go single track and see if you can maintain that posture on a single track and maybe even on a straight line. But yeah, I find the haunches in position very, very effective. Yeah. So, somebody Swarm says, recently I managed to convince my horse to shift his weight onto his butt while walking down a steep dune. Made him so much more comfortable. He stopped jarring me into his shoulders, and it didn't seem to judder the movement down his front legs. It was a bit of a light bulb moment for him too, like, hey, this feels better. Getting him to adopt the same posture downhill at a trot is very hard. Haven't tried the canter. Oh. Yeah, so when the hill is steep enough, they will start sitting behind at some point because it is more comfortable for the horse, more pleasant than jarring onto the front legs. Trotting and cantering downhill, I don't really like to do. If it's a shallow incline down, a shallow slope, you can do that. If it's steeper, then I always worry about the impact on the front legs. So Gloria Cepeda wants to know what is quarters. It's the hind end. It's the hind legs, haunches in, quarters in. Hind quarters to the inside. Then Roha King, do you recommend long and low? Well, if you don't overdo it, you can do it. I don't know if you watched the beginning of the session there. I was talking about exercises you can do where you alternate between having the horse put together, short wheelbase between hind legs and front legs, uphill, short rein, and then letting the horse stretch a little forward, downward from there without losing balance, without dropping the withers, without falling apart, and so on. And then like an accordion, basically, go from the more uphill, more collected posture to the more forward, downward, stretchy, but without falling apart, posture, which is not that easy in a way, but it's a good thing to practice in a sense. It's a good test also for how much you have the horse on your seat and how much you're still relying on the reins and so on, So those are interesting little exercises to do. Gail Guy wants to know, what about headset with haunches in or lead departures? I mean, ideally the horse should stay on the bit, right? When you do this the first time, it's possible that the horses will invert at first because they don't quite know how to organize their body and they don't quite know how to manage, their 4 feet and the body mass in that posture. In that, it depends a little bit exactly how bad it is, right? If it's really bad, maybe it's too early, right, for this kind of exercise. Otherwise, sometimes it helps to flex a little. As the horse inverts and the underneck engages, you could flex and release. And that flexion with one rein can take the tension out of the underneck and then, release a split second later, and then the horse stays rounder and becomes rounder. As they become more organized, and they figure out how to balance themselves in that haunches in posture, they will stay round. It's not a big deal anymore, right? This inverting is usually a certain, clumsiness, loss of balance, a certain stiffness in the hind legs. And as the horse gets to know his body better, as the hind legs get more flexible and stronger, they stay rounder as well, So, I mean, you have to allow the horse a certain degree of experimentation with his body too, so that he discovers that there is a certain posture that is just the most comfortable, right? Which is round and, our correct dressage posture. The horse can then compare, between correct posture, incorrect posture, then hopefully the correct posture overall feels better when he's balanced, when he can relax the muscles more, rather than being out of balance, inverted, and so on, that can't feel good to the horse, right? So, and then you help him find his balance, and as he finds his balance, he will typically then, find the right head and neck position too. So, but sometimes it's a bit of a process too, with a little trial and error, and so it's not perfect the first time, and so you have to be a little patient with the process too. Jane Amaku says, it's been suggested to me that lunging on a slope could be useful. Yeah, you can do training on a slope. Depends a little bit. The slope shouldn't be too steep, and I would incorporate that after the horse has found a pretty good balance on level ground, right? Otherwise, it's too hard. It's you make the horse's job too difficult, right? If they still haven't figured out how to make a round circle in a steady tempo on level ground, and then you put them on a slope, I think that would be too much. That will overface the horse. But once you feel like I can do a nice round circle, steady tempo with a good connection with the lunge line, steady contact, then you can incorporate the, lunging on a slope, and that could be beneficial for the horse, definitely. Yeah. That really pops as my little Morgan mare just cannot figure out that being inverted is more uncomfortable than being round. Always falls back to giraffe modus. I'm sorry. Then Morgan depends on what type of Morgan it is. Some of them, they find it a little bit more difficult maybe. You can help the horse stay balanced, right? So find out exactly why the horse inverts. Is it a crookedness that the horse drifts with one shoulder or with the haunches to one side? Is it that the hind legs like to be a little out behind? What's the conformation like? Is the neck set on very high? Like, is the neck short, thick, or is it a long neck? That sort of thing that all plays a bit of a role in that. And if they like to invert a lot, then typically, riding, voltas and serpentines and little, shoulder four, counter shoulder four kind of exercises usually helps to balance them so that they become round and stay round. Yeah, so the next, Marlies Bohm says, I've noticed that in the last few months, my horse's trapezius and rhomboid muscles are much more obvious. He's also had to go up a saddle gullet width. He's collecting and engaging more, but I'm a little mystified as why this would cause these muscles to hypertrophy. Well, as the horse lifts the withers, the back muscles develop, right? The rib cage gets wider. It's the lifting of the withers that builds the muscles there. It's a good sign. It's basically a sign that you've improved the horse's balance, and then these muscles fill out, right? You can feel it in your seat as the back lifts. You also feel how the rib cage expands. The horse gets wider. You feel like there is more space for you to sit on all of a sudden, right? So and then those muscles around the withers in the back and so on, they just grow, and then you need a different saddle maybe, or need to widen the saddle tree a little bit. Yeah, very good. Anja Reda says, I would be happy. Exactly. That's a good sign. It's a sign that you're doing good work, right? That it's moving in the right direction. Georgi wants to know, what's your view on using running martingale, and for flying leads, should you use a bit more speed at lope? I don't use running martingales. I don't really think that they're helpful. And for flying changes, every horse has a certain tempo, stride length balance in which they can do the flying change easiest, so to speak. And there are horses that benefit from riding a little bit more forward in the canter, because otherwise they overload their hind legs or they get choppy and short, right? Then there are other horses that tend to fall apart. They get too fast by themselves, and they need a little bit more collected canter, maybe slower, maybe a little shorter. Also, then with those horses, it's good to maybe ask for the flying change on a shorter distance, right? Pick a line that's a little short. Whereas the ones that tend to overload the haunches, that tend to over-collect, for them, maybe it's better to choose a longer line where the horse has more space in front of him and then ride a little bit more forward. So it depends on what type of horse you have, right? So you can experiment a little with what works best, right? So there are those and those, right? So, yeah. Jackie Billington says, I have a friend with a horse who always wants to drop behind the vertical, contract his neck, and drop his withers slightly and avoid using his hind legs that way. What would you suggest for this horse? He's an expert at fake collections, very sensitive, thoroughbred Welsh with a wonderfully athletic body. Interesting. Yeah, so the dropping behind the vertical, and shortening the neck usually is a way of protecting the hind legs from having to flex and carry the weight. Sometimes there's an element of like a difficulty in the paw and throat latch, depending on how he's built. I mean, some thoroughbreds that are rigid a little bit in the throat latch, and the Welsh cobs, they can be a little baroque. So if the neck is short and thick, with a thick short pole, then it could be that it's not very flexible, and then the horse might want to protect the pole from actually flexing left or right or releasing, and then they sometimes drop the neck. But the ones that really like to overbend and get behind the vertical are often the ones with a long neck. And there are horses that have a long neck, maybe even a naturally arched neck, and still have a tight pole, a difficult pole. They just always yield at the base of the neck first, right? And with these horses, so it depends a little bit on whether the issue is more with the hind legs or with the pole or both. If you find exercises that bring the hind legs under the body so you can sit on them, then the horse will lift his neck, and then you have to expect him to go above the bit first, right? Which is not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. It's like the lesser evil, right? And then once the head is up and even in front of above the bit, you could then see if you can loosen the paw with some flexing exercises. If there is a blockage in the paw, sometimes it actually helps. Like if you are on the ground, standing in front of the horse, lift the neck straight up so the head is almost horizontal, and then flex at that position a couple of times, left and right, and then release. And then often the pole is looser, something is unhinged, and it's more mobile, and then works better. Otherwise, you can get the horse to lift the head up. Usually, when you do things like turns on the forehand in motion, a few steps to the left, a few steps to the right, so that where the horse has to shift the weight, engage one hind, engage the other hind, like that usually brings the head and neck up very quickly, right? Full pass left and right also could be used for that. You could try little zigzags, if you do like a double zigzag on the long side. And whether you do this in more of a leg yield or more of a half pass kind of movement is up to you. You can, there's all these different versions, right? Leg yield in, half pass out, half pass in, leg yield out, and so on. These are things you can try. So that can help with getting the pole up. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game with the hind legs, right? Like put the hind legs under the body and sit on them, and then he will probably try to find a way of getting the hind leg out back, or letting the front legs creep forward, or getting a little crooked, so that he always tries to take the weight off of the hind leg probably, and then you have to try and put it back on, right? So sometimes you can also do this with getting very creative with your patterns, ride some turns and transitions, and that he doesn't expect, ride some lateral movements in places where he's not used to it, so that that you're always a step ahead of him in your thinking, and he has to catch up and rearrange his body to be able to do what you want him to do, and that typically gets the horse also to lift the head up. So these are some things I would try. Yeah. So Jackie says the rider of the thoroughbred Welsh is a little fearful of his power, so this may be making her hold on to him with the hands more than is good. Could be a good part of the problem, actually, which is probably causing this, but it's hard to break the cycle for her and him. Yep. How about if somebody else rides the horse to get him over that habit, to break that cycle of curling? Of course, if you change the horse's balance, the head goes up, and then the rider immediately, like a reflex, catches on the rein and pulls the horse back behind the vertical, then it's not likely to go away. I've seen people in lessons too, where they had been so conditioned on the head has to be down, right? And the horses had accommodated that and were a little short in the neck, a little behind the vertical. And then I tried to set up situations where the horse would lift the front end more and lift the paw and bring the nose forward. And then the old habits in the rider basically made them give a little tug on the rein. The instant the head of the horse came up, and then, of course, the horse goes right back down, right? And that can be a tricky thing. Of course, what you could do is have the rider take the reins in one hand and ride with the reins in one hand, and they can't pull as much, right? And then the horses that like to curl up, they tend to lengthen the neck and lift the poll and stick the nose out, more easily when you have the reins in one hand. That's more inviting to them. So if the rider agrees to that, if they're not too scared to do that, that could be a possibility. Sometimes, riding with a cabochon instead of a bit can also help get the nose out in front again. Horses will often take a little bit more solid contact with the cabochon than a bit. With a cabochon, you could also lift a little bit, and then send the hind legs forwards. Like you can invite him with the cabochon reins, lift the head up a little bit, release, send him forward with your leg and seat, so he steps under that. That's a possibility. Yeah, so I'll experiment a little bit, but I suspect the real issue is the rider, being a little nervous, a little afraid, and then tugging on the reins to pull the head down again. So, and that's tricky, right? Okay, so Jackie says no long neck and is not short in his neck and his skeleton. Okay, yeah, the thoroughbreds usually have the long neck. The Welsh can have shorter necks sometimes, but yeah, so makes sense that it's a long neck. But yeah, check for blockages in the pole throat latch anyway. Sometimes it happens even with the long necks. And check for blockages in the hips, muscle stiffness in the hips. But yeah, I suspect that the rider's fear reflex is sort of the biggest factor there. And so Jackie says also exactly this is the case when another rider rides its horse is improved, yeah. But the owner can't seem to let her hands go and loosen up her hips and shoulders and back. That is the issue. So what happens if you teach her a lunge lesson, a seat lesson on that horse, where she doesn't get to hold the reins? Another thing you could try, actually, if you're both up for it, is long rein the rider on the horse, where the rider doesn't get any reins. The rider just sits there. You have the reins, long reining the horse, so you have control. Then the rider doesn't have to worry about controlling the horse. And if she trusts you enough, then she won't be afraid, right? And then you can work the horse at the long rein so that the neck gets longer. And then when that feels good, the riders learn a certain feel when you long rein them. They get to experience a different balance in the horse. Then you could let her take the reins, maybe cabezon reins, like you could long rein with your reins attached to the cabezon, right? And the rider could then, once everything is good, pick up the reins attached to the snaffle. And then you could back off a little with the long rein, right? And just walk with her, keep your long reins slack and let the rider take over. And then if it falls apart, you can tell her drop the reins and then you long rein the horse, put Humpty Dumpty back together, so to speak, right? And then it goes back and forth like that. So that could be a really good technique. I know you long rein, so that would be sometimes a really good way to fix things like that. And it's long reining the rider can be a great way to teach feel, so they experience a different balance on the horse. Yeah, so Jackie says great ideas. Yeah, try it out. I mean, one of them will work probably, right? And you can always develop new ideas based on these trains of thoughts, right? So. And I know you do the Branderup system, so I'm sure your student probably has a cabezon and is probably used to riding with a cabezon. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with cabezon and snaffle, and or just the cabezon, no snaffle. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. You have a lot of tools already that you can use to fix that. Yeah. Very good. Let's see here. Kathy Sugarman says, my horse is 17. He has reasonable amp of muscles. Is it hard to keep that as he gets older? Shouldn't be. You should be able to maintain that. I mean, as they get older, you may have to modify the way you're training them, switch the program a little bit, maybe incorporate more work in hand and long reining, less riding, that sort of thing. But you should be able to maintain the muscling. The Spanish riding school, they can do it. So it's, it should be possible to keep the muscling. Ron Delaney says, I had a wonderful lesson today where I clearly felt the difference between a horse in a framed neck with no true contact and a horse that was stepping from behind into a true rein contact where I could feel his hind legs in the firmer rein feel. I ride a Morgan also and have been having a better time with my rein contact since listening to your live feeds. Thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. That's awesome that it helps. So yeah, and it's great when you feel the contrast, right? I mean, when a horse sort of fakes the frame but doesn't have a real connection from the hind legs to the bit, it's a horrible feeling, and it's really not that easy to get them to reach forward and make that contact. It's tricky. Once you have it, it's great, right? But it's almost like the horse has to trust the rein, trust your hand, and take a little leap of faith to reach and, hope that it's going to be okay, right? And then once they've stretched their neck out and they made the connection and they realize, oh yeah, it's not that bad, nothing horrible is happening, then it gets easier to recreate that. But often these retracted necks, they come out of bad experiences with people just fiddling with the reins and trying to get the head down, get the nose in, and without really caring about what the rest of the body is doing, right? And then once the horses have developed a habit like that, it can be tricky to get them to lengthen the frame and reach for the contact again, right? But in that case too, try riding with the reins in one hand. Very often they actually like that better. Or try riding with a cavesson. They tend to go a little bit more into the contact with the cavesson. It's like that they trust that more. Especially if it's a horse that has never been ridden with a cavesson, only with a snaffle, then it's a whole new sensation in a different part of the head. And then there is no baggage, so to speak, with a cavesson, and then they might be a very different horse all of a sudden, than with a snaffle. So then Marley says, converse of my question above, rode a horse last week who has been out of work because of a heel injury and a variety of skin issues and cuts for most of the last 6 months. He lost a lot of top line muscles. He also feels very unbalanced. I watch him canter. In the field, he looks like an old oil painting with a belly sunk and the legs stretch out in all directions. When ridden, he now gets really grumpy, especially at canter, and I wonder, pinning his ears, tossing his head, coming above the contact. He's been treated for stomach ulcers. Saddle fitter has had the chiropractor and the physiotherapist with this horse's temperament. It's very difficult to judge whether his brain is in his brain or in his body. Yeah. Can his lack of back muscles now make it painful for him to carry the rider? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if he's lost all the muscles, right, and the back sags, then this gets uncomfortable for the back muscles, also for the spine. I mean, that's essentially how kissing spines can develop too, right? So it's very possible that now the weight of the rider bothers him. So in a horse like that, I would actually probably not ride for a while, but I would try to build the balance and the muscles with lunging or double lunging that'll work in hand, things like that. And then once you feel like now he's, rebuilt his musculature, he's lifting his back, again, then I would start sitting on him. But while he looks like a bathtub, so to speak, I probably wouldn't ride the horse and do groundwork, lunging, double lunging, work in hand, whatever you can do, lunging over cavalettes, little free jumping, so that he has to engage his belly muscles and lift his back and so on to develop the top line. And then, later I would ride again, Actually, for a horse like that, you could, I don't know, yeah. We did a little Facebook Live a little while ago with Noor Tanger and Patrick Molenaar from Holland. They specialize in rehabbing horses. If you couldn't watch those lives, they talk about how they do that, and they lunge and double lunge for a while, do a little in hand work, and they may not ride the horse for several months, depending, on what the musculature looks like, and then only when they feel like, okay, now the horse is building, has rebuilt his top line to a degree and looks strong enough, then they start riding, and then you'll make quicker progress, and it's a nicer process for the horse. Then if you try to do it all in the saddle, right away. Yeah, let's see. So we'll do one more. Anya Reda, then we have to finish. So Anya says, my mare had again a blockage in the left sacroiliac and has been worse after osteopathic treatment with raising the left croup. Now I give her anti-inflammatory products. I don't know really how I should start riding again in the best way. I thought about very little lateral movements on a big circle with a cavasson. Is it a good idea? Might be. She says, day after osteopathy, I made did a double lunge run today, walking together outside. It's interesting that it's worse after the osteopath adjusted the horse. Maybe that's just the initial reaction for a day or two, that could happen, and then it should get better. Giving her anti-inflammatory medicine is a good idea. I might do a little, lunging, double lunging for a while without sitting on the horse. And you can do a little work in hand too. It's like when the double lunging, single track work, of course, and then you could do a little work in hand and see what happens if you engage the inside hind. Like you could lead on a circle, ask the inside hind to step under the body a little bit more and see how she reacts, right? Does it look painful? Does it seem okay? Do you feel like she's better afterwards? Does it feel, or does she seem to feel better the day after? Often you don't see the result of the exercise or the workout until a day later or 2 days later. Right? So, because sometimes things may go well or seem like they're going well as you're doing them, and then the next day you see, the horse feels much worse now than it did the day before. So maybe it wasn't such a good idea to do this, right? Or it could happen that as you're doing an exercise, you're not real happy with the way it's going. It's like, I don't really feel like I'm getting anywhere with this. But the next day, the horse is better. It's like they slept on it. The body had time to digest the exercise. And the next day, the horse feels better. That happens too. So I would experiment a little with that. But yeah, maybe do the lunging, the double lunging until that sacroiliac has calmed down a little bit. And then add with a little riding. And yeah, if you walk together outside, if you have hills where your barn is, that might not be a bad thing to do. And once you feel like the sacroiliac has calmed down and it's no longer uncomfortable, then incorporate the riding again. And maybe warm up at the lunge line, or double lunge line before you get on. You don't, necessarily need to do the training all under saddle or on days when you ride. You don't need to do everything under saddle from start to finish. You could do any number of things, right? Lunging, double lunging, long reining, work in hand. Like if you've never long reined, that would be maybe an interesting thing to try, see what happens, see if the horse likes it. Most horses like long reining, and gives you another perspective because you see the horse's body from a different angle. You can see exactly what the hind legs are doing and how that translates to back, shoulder, neck, pole, etc. So I learned a lot from long reining, and it helped my understanding a great deal because you really see things played out, in front of your eyes. And then Lila Cansfield says, just wanted to say that I have a 22-year-old mare that had a really saggy back. I really didn't think it would come up again. She has just had to have a saddle refit her back. Her back has come up so much, like you say, did lots on the ground before much riding. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, exactly. You can do a lot with lunging and in hand work to help the horse, right? To prepare the horse also for the rider's weight, right? So Nadia was saying, okay, I did lateral work with double lunging yesterday. Today it's been a little better. Oh, good sign, right? Yeah. So I would probably stick with that for a little bit until you get the sense that she's ready to ride again, and then the horse will probably let you know the horse well, so you can probably estimate when the horse is feeling good enough again to carry the weight. Yeah. All right, so let's quit with that. It's been a little over an hour. I know there's a couple more questions, but this could go on forever, right? So Yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for all the good questions.